Close your eyes and imagine the quiet desert landscape of modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India. A warm wind moves gently across fields of dust and sand, brushing over scattered stones and patches of dry grass. Nothing interrupts the stillness except the faint whisper of air passing through what appears to be natural hills dotting the landscape. But beneath this peaceful desert lies something extraordinary, something that was lost for 4,000 years. The Indus Valley Civilization flourished more than 4,000 years ago, along the fertile plains of the Indus River and its tributaries. At its height around 2500 BCE, this remarkable civilization stretched across a vast region covering parts of modern Pakistan, northwest India, and eastern Afghanistan, an area larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. This wasn't just a single city or a small cluster of settlements. It was a sophisticated network of hundreds of urban centers and villages, connected by trade routes, shared culture, and remarkably similar architectural standards. Yet today, these once thriving cities stand silent and abandoned. The people who built them have vanished from history, leaving behind only their magnificent ruins and countless unanswered questions. For thousands of years, these ancient cities lay buried beneath accumulated layers of soil and sand, while empires rose and fell above them. Local inhabitants knew these strange mounds as hills of the dead, having no idea that beneath their feet lay the remains of one of humanity's first great urban civilizations. The story of their rediscovery begins in the mid-1800s, when British colonial engineers were building railroads across India. Workers searching for ballast, crushed stone and brick to support the railway tracks began excavating these mysterious mounds. They found thousands upon thousands of ancient bricks, perfectly uniform in size and shape, which they crushed and used in railroad construction. For decades, the bricks of a 4,000-year-old civilization supported British trains, with no one realizing they were destroying irreplaceable archaeological treasures. It wasn't until the 1920s that archaeologists began to understand what they had found. The excavations revealed something impossible for its age: planned cities with straight streets laid out in perfect grids, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized brick manufacturing, and public architecture that demonstrated remarkable engineering knowledge. This discovery would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the ancient world and reveal a civilization that had been completely forgotten by human memory. The systematic discovery of the Indus Valley Civilization began in earnest in 1921, when archaeologist Daya Ram Sani started excavating at a site called Harappa in the Punjab region of British India. Almost simultaneously, another archaeologist named R.D. Banerjee was working at a site called Mohenjo-daro in the Sindh region, about 400 miles to the southwest. Both archaeologists were investigating Buddhist monuments from a much later period, when they discovered something far more ancient beneath the later structures. As they dug deeper, they uncovered the remains of ancient cities featuring brick buildings, organized streets, and sophisticated drainage systems. The artifacts they found, carved seals, pottery, tools, and jewelry, were unlike anything known from other ancient civilizations. Most intriguingly, they discovered small stone seals, carved with unknown symbols and images of animals. This was clearly writing, but it didn't match any known ancient script. It wasn't Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform, or any other recognized form of writing. In 1924, John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, announced these discoveries to the world. The response from the international scholarly community was one of shock and excitement. Here was a third great Bronze Age civilization, contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but completely unknown to history. No ancient Greek or Roman texts mentioned it. The Bible said nothing about it. It had simply vanished from human memory, until archaeologists stumbled upon its ruins while building modern infrastructure. As excavations continued throughout the 20th century, more Indus sites were discovered. Archaeologists found Kalibangan in Rajasthan, Lothal in Gujarat, Dholavira on an island in the Rann of Kutch, and Rakhigarhi in Haryana. In fact, over 1,400 Indus Valley sites have now been identified, ranging from small villages to major urban centers. Each new discovery revealed more about this mysterious civilization while simultaneously raising more questions. The civilization appeared to have flourished from approximately 3,300 BCE to 1,300 BCE, with its mature urban phase lasting from about 2,600 BCE to 1,900 BCE. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization covered an area of about 1.25 million square kilometers, making it the largest of the ancient civilizations in terms of geographic extent. Population estimates suggest that as many as 5 million people may have lived within its territory during the civilization's height. What makes this civilization particularly frustrating for historians is the absence of readable texts. Unlike ancient Egypt, which left behind extensive hieroglyphic inscriptions telling us about pharaohs, gods, and daily life, or Mesopotamia, with its thousands of cuneiform tablets recording everything from legal contracts to epic poems. The Indus Valley Civilization left only short inscriptions on seals and pottery. Despite a century of effort by scholars using every available linguistic and computational method, the Indus script remains undeciphered. We can see their cities, hold their tools, and examine their art, but we cannot read their words or know their thoughts. The discoveries at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro revealed cities of remarkable sophistication. The urban planning was extraordinarily advanced, with streets laid out in neat grids, houses built with standardized bricks, and comprehensive drainage systems that wouldn't be matched in many parts of the world for thousands of years. The consistency of architectural styles, brick sizes, and urban planning across hundreds of miles suggested a highly organized civilization with strong central standards. Yet curiously, archaeologists found no obvious palaces, no massive royal tombs, and no clear evidence of the kind of monarchical rule that characterized Egypt and Mesopotamia. The city of Mohenjo-daro, one of the largest Indus Valley settlements, demonstrates urban planning that seems almost modern in its organization. Unlike most ancient cities that grew organically over time, with winding streets and haphazard building placement, Mohenjo-daro was laid out according to a careful plan before construction began. The city is divided into two main sections: the citadel, built on an artificial raised platform about 40 feet above the surrounding area, and the lower city, where most of the population lived. The street layout follows a precise grid pattern, with major boulevards running north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles. The main streets are remarkably wide, about 30 feet across, allowing easy passage for carts, animals, and crowds of people. Smaller residential streets, typically about 9 feet wide, branch off from these main thoroughfares. This grid system created organized blocks of housing and made navigation through the city straightforward and logical. What makes this planning even more remarkable is the standardization of building materials. The bricks used throughout the Indus civilization follow a precise ratio of 4:2, 1 for length, width, and height. This standardization appears at every Indus site, regardless of location, suggesting a unified system of weights and measures used across the entire civilization. The bricks weren't made of simple mud-dried clay, but were kiln-fired, making them much more durable and weather-resistant. This is why so many have survived for over 4,000 years. The houses themselves varied in size, from small 2- or 3-room dwellings to large multi-room complexes with multiple courtyards. But the variation wasn't extreme. While wealthier families clearly had larger homes, there's nothing comparable to the massive palaces found in other ancient civilizations. The relatively modest differences in house sizes suggest a society that was more balanced and egalitarian than typical ancient civilizations, where ruling classes often lived in luxury, while common people lived in poverty. The citadel area contained the city's most important public buildings. Here stood the Great Bath, large granaries for storing food supplies, and what appear to be assembly halls or administrative buildings. The elevated position protected these crucial structures from the periodic flooding of the Indus River. Archaeological evidence shows that the cities were rebuilt multiple times after flood damage, but remarkably, the basic street grid and urban layout remained consistent through these rebuilding phases. This suggests strong civic institutions that maintained established standards across generations. The careful planning extended underground as well. Beneath the streets ran a comprehensive network of covered drains designed to carry wastewater away from residential areas. This drainage system had to be planned before construction began because it required precise calculations of gradients to ensure proper water flow. The drains were constructed with brick channels covered with brick slabs that could be removed for maintenance and cleaning. The existence of inspection holes at regular intervals shows that the builders understood the need for ongoing maintenance of the system. Perhaps the most impressive feature of Indus cities was their sophisticated sanitation system. Almost every house in Mohenjo-daro had a private bathroom with a brick floor sloped toward a drain. These weren't simple outhouses in courtyards, but actual rooms inside the houses, typically located near the entrance. Many bathrooms featured what appear to be seated or squat-style toilets, connected directly to the drainage system. Each house's drainage system connected to the street drains through carefully engineered channels. The street drains themselves were marvels of civil engineering. Brick-lined channels running beneath the streets, with removable covers for maintenance access. The drains were sloped at precisely calculated gradients to ensure that wastewater flowed away from residential areas toward collection points or eventually to the river. Inspection holes built into the system at regular intervals allowed workers to remove blockages and perform necessary maintenance. This level of urban sanitation was unprecedented in the ancient world and wouldn't be matched in many regions for thousands of years. Ancient Rome, famous for its sewers, didn't develop the cloaca maxima until around 600 BCE. Nearly 2,000 years after the Indus drainage systems were built, medieval European cities were notorious for unsanitary conditions, with waste often dumped into streets, contributing to devastating plague outbreaks. London didn't have a comprehensive sewer system until the 1860s, after cholera epidemics killed tens of thousands. The Indus sanitation system required not just initial construction, but ongoing maintenance. Archaeological evidence shows that the drains were regularly cleaned and repaired, indicating a civic administration that understood the importance of public health infrastructure. This commitment to sanitation would have had significant health benefits. Waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid thrive in unsanitary conditions where human waste contaminates water supplies. The separation of clean water from wastewater would have dramatically reduced disease rates. Skeletal evidence supports this conclusion. Analysis of human remains from Indus sites shows that the population was generally healthy and well-nourished, with less evidence of disease and malnutrition than found in many contemporary ancient populations. This better health would have increased life expectancy, reduced infant mortality, and allowed cities to sustain larger, denser populations without the devastating epidemics that plagued other ancient urban centers. The emphasis on sanitation and public health infrastructure reveals something important about Indus Valley priorities. While other civilizations were building pyramids, ziggurats, and monuments to glorify gods and kings, the Indus people invested heavily in practical infrastructure that served everyone. This suggests a society that valued functionality and public welfare over monumental displays of power and prestige. At the heart of Mohenjo-daro's citadel stands one of the most enigmatic structures ever discovered from the ancient world, the Great Bath. This large rectangular pool measures approximately 40 feet in length, 23 feet in width, and 8 feet in depth. Brick steps descend into the pool from both the north and south sides, wide enough to accommodate multiple people simultaneously. The entire structure demonstrates remarkable engineering sophistication for its age. The bath was constructed using tightly fitted bricks, but since brick is porous and would normally allow water to seep through, the builders waterproofed it using bitumen, a natural tar-like substance. They layered bitumen between the bricks, sealing every joint to create a completely watertight structure. This waterproofing remained effective for centuries, allowing the bath to hold water without leaking. The floor and walls were carefully constructed to withstand the constant pressure of the water they contained. Around the bath's perimeter is a gallery or walkway where people could stand and look down into the pool. On both the eastern and western sides are 8 small rooms, each with its own door, opening onto the gallery, but not to the outside. These rooms may have served as changing rooms where people could prepare before entering the water, or they might have had ritual purposes related to the bath's function. The room's design, accessible only through the gallery, not from outside, suggests they were specifically connected to the bath's use. The bath had both a filling and drainage system. A well, in one of the adjacent rooms, may have supplied the water, though there might also have been channels bringing water from other sources. An outlet in one corner connected to a drain that led outside the building, allowing the bath to be emptied for cleaning and refilling with fresh water. This system indicates that the bath was regularly used and maintained, not simply a decorative or symbolic structure left permanently dry. The Great Bath's purpose remains a mystery. Its location on the citadel, the quality of its construction, and the elaborate architectural features all suggest it was important to civic or religious life, but we have no inscriptions or texts explaining its use. Many scholars believe it served a ritual purpose, possibly for ceremonial bathing or purification rites. Ritual bathing appears in many ancient and modern religions, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and others, where water represents spiritual as well as physical cleansing. The private rooms surrounding the bath support the ritual interpretation, providing spaces for individual preparation, meditation, or ritual dressing before entering the communal bathing area. However, other interpretations are possible. The bath might have served medical purposes if the Indus people believed water had therapeutic properties. It could have been a social gathering place, similar to Roman baths, built centuries later. Or it might have served multiple purposes, ritual, social, and hygienic, simultaneously. Without being able to read the Indus script, we can only speculate based on the physical evidence the structure provides. One of the most frustrating aspects of studying the Indus Valley Civilization is that we don't even know what these people called themselves. We use modern names, Indus Valley Civilization, or Harappan Civilization. But these are our labels, not theirs. Their actual name is locked away in their undeciphered writing system. We can examine their physical remains, their artifacts, and their cities, but we cannot hear their voices or know their personal stories the way we can with civilizations that left readable texts. Skeletal analysis provides some information about the Indus people's physical characteristics and health. They were generally healthy and well-nourished, with average heights of about 5 feet 6 inches for men and 5 feet for women, normal for the Bronze Age. Dental analysis shows relatively good dental health, compared to many contemporary populations, suggesting adequate and varied nutrition beyond just grain-based diets. Bone analysis indicates that most people were physically active and muscular, consistent with populations engaged in crafts, farming, and labor, but without the severe deformations seen in populations subjected to brutal forced labor or extreme hardship. The social structure of Indus society is puzzling because it doesn't fit expected patterns. Unlike Egypt with its god-kings and massive pyramids, or Mesopotamia with its royal palaces and temple complexes, the Indus Valley shows no clear evidence of powerful monarchs. There are no massive royal tombs, no palaces obviously grander than other buildings, no statues of kings, and no obvious royal regalia. The variation in house sizes is moderate, rather than extreme. Some people clearly had more wealth than others, but the inequality wasn't nearly as dramatic as in other ancient civilizations. This suggests either that Indus rulers were unusually modest, building no monuments to themselves, or that the society had a fundamentally different organization. Perhaps merchant councils governed the cities, or religious authorities who didn't demand grand temples, or some form of collective governance unknown in other ancient civilizations. The relatively egalitarian appearance of Indus cities has led some scholars to suggest they may have been among the most socially balanced ancient societies. Trade provides important clues about Indus society and economy. The Indus people were extensive traders, whose seals have been found in Mesopotamia, in the Persian Gulf region, and along ancient trade routes connecting the civilizations. Mesopotamian texts, from around 2300 BCE, mention a trading partner called Meluha, which most scholars believe refers to the Indus region. These texts describe ships from Meluha, bringing carnelian beads, ivory, timber, cotton cloth, and precious stones, all items the Indus civilization produced. Long-distance trade required significant organization and resources. It meant building and maintaining ships, training sailors, producing trade goods in sufficient quantities, establishing relationships with foreign kingdoms, and managing the logistics of moving goods across dangerous waters and long distances. The Indus civilization did all of this successfully for centuries, indicating a sophisticated economy that went far beyond simple village agriculture. They had specialized workshops where craftsmen produced goods specifically for trade, including bead makers, metal workers, and textile producers. Religion remains largely mysterious. The Indus people certainly had beliefs and spiritual practices, but we don't know what they were. No massive temples have been definitively identified, no clear religious texts exist, and there are no obvious large-scale religious monuments. Small figurines have been found, including female figures that some scholars interpret as mother goddesses or fertility symbols, and male figures in what appear to be meditation poses that some see as proto-Shiva figures, potentially connecting to later Hindu traditions. Some seals show figures surrounded by animals in poses that might be yogic, possibly representing deities or spiritual practices, but all interpretation is speculative, without texts to guide us. Daily life is easier to reconstruct from physical evidence. Children played with toys, including miniature carts, small animal figures, whistles shaped like birds, and dice for games. Adults wore jewelry, including bangles, necklaces, and earrings. They cooked in clay pots on clay ovens, eating meals based on wheat, barley, rice in some areas, lentils, peas, sesame, and supplemented with fish, chicken, and possibly beef and mutton. They lived in family groups, likely extended families with multiple generations sharing larger houses. They worked, raised children, and conducted all the ordinary activities of human life. But their specific thoughts, beliefs, and personal stories remain frustratingly out of reach until we can decipher their writing. The Indus Valley Civilization was deeply integrated into the wider ancient world through extensive trade networks. Archaeological evidence shows that Indus merchants traveled great distances and maintained commercial relationships with civilizations thousands of miles away. The discovery of Indus seals in Mesopotamian cities provides concrete proof of these connections, and Mesopotamian cuneiform texts from the period specifically mention trade with a land they called Meluha, which scholars have identified as the Indus region. The primary trade route appears to have been maritime, using ships to sail along the Arabian Sea coastline and through the Persian Gulf to reach Mesopotamian ports. This was dangerous and difficult navigation requiring skilled sailors, reliable ships, and detailed knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal weather patterns. The fact that Indus merchants successfully maintained these trade routes for centuries demonstrates their maritime capabilities and organizational skills. Indus exports included items that were highly valued in other ancient civilizations. Carnelian beads, made from a semi-precious red stone, were particularly prized. Indus craftsmen had developed sophisticated techniques for cutting, drilling, and polishing carnelian to create beautiful beads that have been found throughout Mesopotamia. Other exports included ivory from elephants, timber including valuable teakwood, cotton textiles. The Indus region may have been the first place where cotton was cultivated and woven into cloth. Lapis lazuli, and other precious stones, and various metal goods. In exchange, the Indus imported materials they lacked locally, particularly metals needed for tools and weapons. Copper came from regions to the west, tin, necessary for making bronze, from even more distant sources, possibly including Afghanistan or Central Asia, gold from Karnataka in southern India, and silver from various sources. The need for these materials created powerful economic incentives for maintaining long-distance trade networks. The commercial nature of Indus society is evident in their urban architecture. Many houses contained workshops for specialized crafts. Excavations have revealed areas dedicated to bead-making, with tools, raw materials, and partially finished beads still in place. Metalworking areas show evidence of copper and bronze production. Pottery workshops with kilns and wheels have been found. This specialization meant that craftsmen could focus on becoming highly skilled at particular trades while depending on others for food, other goods, and services, a hallmark of urban, commercially oriented societies. The Indus people developed standardized weights and measures essential for fair trade. Archaeologists have found numerous weight stones made from carefully shaped materials, following a binary system where each weight is double the previous one. These standardized weights appear at Indus sites across the civilization, suggesting a unified system of trade standards. Such standardization requires central authority or widely accepted conventions, indicating the sophistication of Indus commercial practices. Seals played a crucial role in trade and administration. Thousands of small stone seals have been found, typically square-shaped and carved, with animal images and short inscriptions in the Indus script. These seals were likely used to mark goods, identify merchants or organizations, and authenticate transactions. The seals would be pressed into soft clay to create an impression, similar to how wax seals were used in later periods. The images on seals, bulls, elephants, tigers, and mysterious creatures sometimes called unicorns, might have represented merchant families, guilds, or administrative offices. The scale of Indus trade was substantial. Lothal, a coastal city in Gujarat, had a massive dockyard with a brick basin measuring about 700 feet long and 120 feet wide, connected to an ancient river channel leading to the sea. This engineering feat demonstrates the importance of maritime trade to the Indus economy. Ships could load and unload cargo in protected waters, safe from storms and tides. The existence of such infrastructure shows that trade wasn't occasional or small scale, but a major, continuous economic activity requiring significant investment. Trade also facilitated cultural exchange. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles moved along with goods. The Indus people would have encountered foreign languages, different religious practices, new technologies, and diverse ways of organizing society. This exposure to other cultures might have influenced their own development, though the extent of such influence is difficult to determine from archaeological evidence alone. One of the greatest mysteries of the Indus Valley Civilization is its writing system. Thousands of inscribed objects have been found, mostly seals, but also pottery, tools, and other artifacts, bearing sequences of mysterious symbols. These symbols constitute what scholars call the Indus script, but despite a century of intense study, no one has successfully deciphered it. We can see the writing, but we cannot read it, making the Indus people effectively mute, despite leaving behind numerous written artifacts. The Indus script appears to be logosyllabic, meaning it likely used symbols that represented both whole words, or concepts, and syllabic sounds. This is similar to how Egyptian hieroglyphics, or Mesopotamian cuneiform worked. However, unlike those ancient scripts which were deciphered using bilingual inscriptions, like the Rosetta Stone for Egyptian hieroglyphics, no bilingual text has been found for the Indus script. Without a text that provides the same content in both Indus script and a known language, scholars lack the key tool that cracked other ancient writing systems. The inscriptions are frustratingly brief. Most seal inscriptions contain only 4 or 5 symbols, with the longest known inscription having about 26 symbols. These short texts probably record names, titles, or brief information about goods and ownership. But they don't provide the extended passages that would help linguists understand grammar, syntax, and meaning. Compare this to Mesopotamia, where thousands of clay tablets with lengthy texts survived, allowing scholars to systematically decipher cuneiform. Scholars have identified about 400 to 450 distinct Indus symbols, though not all appear frequently. The number of symbols suggests it's neither a simple alphabet, which would have far fewer symbols, perhaps 20-30, nor a purely pictographic system, which would need thousands of symbols to represent every concept. This intermediate number is consistent with a logosyllabic system, but doesn't prove it definitively. Attempts to decipher the script have followed various approaches. Some scholars have tried to connect it to known language families, particularly Dravidian languages, still spoken in southern India, suggesting that the Indus people might have been Dravidian speakers whose descendants moved south. Others have proposed connections to Indo-European languages, to Sumerian, or to language families that no longer exist. Computer analysis has been applied to identify patterns, statistical regularities, and potential grammatical structures. But without a bilingual text, or much longer inscriptions, these analyses can only generate hypotheses, not proof. The lack of longer texts is puzzling. Other ancient civilizations produced extensive written records, legal codes, religious texts, historical chronicles, literary works, administrative records. If the Indus people had such texts, they haven't survived or haven't been found. This could mean they wrote on perishable materials like palm leaves or bark that decayed over millennia, or that their society simply didn't produce the kinds of lengthy texts common in Egypt and Mesopotamia, or that archives and libraries remain buried at sites not yet excavated. The mystery of the undeciphered script means we cannot answer basic questions about the Indus civilization. We don't know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what gods they worshipped, who their leaders were, what their laws stated, or what stories they told. We're like people watching a silent film without intertitles. We can see what's happening, but cannot hear the dialogue or understand the full context. Some scholars have even questioned whether the symbols constitute true writing at all, suggesting they might be religious or decorative symbols rather than a complete writing system. However, most experts believe the regular patterns, the clear organization of symbols into sequences, and the consistent use across the civilization indicate genuine writing, even if we cannot yet read it. Until someone discovers a Rosetta Stone for the Indus script, perhaps a seal or inscription that provides the same text in both Indus symbols and a known language, or finds much longer texts that would allow linguistic analysis, the writing will remain mysterious. And with it, the voices of the Indus people will remain silent, their words locked away in symbols we can see but not comprehend, frustrating our attempts to truly understand one of humanity's first great civilizations. Despite our inability to read their writing, we can reconstruct many aspects of daily life in Indus cities through archaeological evidence. The physical remains of houses, tools, pottery, and other artifacts provide rich details about how ordinary people lived 4,000 years ago. Most families lived in brick houses, arranged along the grid-patterned streets. A typical middle-class house might have 4 to 6 rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The courtyard served as the heart of domestic life, a space open to the sky, where cooking, craftwork, socializing, and many daily activities took place. Rooms opening off the courtyard provided private spaces for sleeping, storage, and shelter during bad weather. The houses were remarkably well constructed with walls made of baked brick rather than mud brick, providing better protection from monsoon rains and seasonal flooding. Floors were typically brick or packed earth. Many houses had private wells in their courtyards, providing direct access to fresh water without needing to visit public wells. This convenience was unusual for ancient cities and speaks to the Indus emphasis on domestic comfort and hygiene. Cooking took place in courtyards or in dedicated kitchen areas using clay ovens. These ovens, called cholas, were essentially enclosed fire pits made of clay with openings for feeding in fuel and for placing pots. Women, we assume primarily women, though we can't be certain about gender divisions of labor, would prepare meals using clay pots, grinding stones for making flour, and various utensils. The diet was diverse and nutritious, based on wheat and barley as staple grains, supplemented with rice, in some regions, lentils and other pulses, vegetables, sesame seeds for oil, and fish or meat when available. Craftsmen worked in specialized workshops, often located in specific neighborhoods or districts of the city. Bead makers would cut, drill, and polish semi-precious stones, like carnelian and lapis lazuli, into beads used for jewelry and trade. This was skilled work, requiring specialized tools, drills, grinding stones, polishing materials, and a considerable patience. A single carnelian bead might take hours or even days to produce, involving careful drilling to create the hole without cracking the stone. Potters worked with wheels and kilns to produce ceramic vessels in standardized shapes. Indus pottery was functional and well made, though not as elaborately decorated as pottery from some other ancient civilizations. Common forms included large storage jars for grain or water, cooking pots, serving dishes, and small vessels for oils or medicines. The potter's wheel had been invented in earlier Mesopotamia and adopted by Indus craftsmen, allowing them to produce uniform, symmetrical vessels quickly. Metal workers created tools and weapons from copper and bronze, along with decorative items and jewelry. They used sophisticated techniques, including lost wax casting, for creating complex bronze objects. The famous dancing girl statue from Mohenjo-daro demonstrates their skill. A small bronze figure of a young woman in a confident pose, wearing bangles on her arm, created using the lost wax process about 4,500 years ago. Children's toys tell us about childhood in Indus cities. Archaeologists have found miniature carts with movable wheels, small animal figures, whistles shaped like birds, spinning tops, and dice made from fired clay or stone. These toys suggest that Indus children, like children everywhere, played imaginative games, mimicking adult activities. The miniature carts particularly indicate that children were familiar with the real carts, used for transportation and trade, in the cities. Adults wore jewelry that showed considerable artistry and craftsmanship. Women wore bangles, made from shell, clay, copper, or bronze, sometimes dozens of bangles on each arm. Necklaces of semi-precious stone beads were common, with carnelian, lapis lazuli, and agate being particularly favored. Earrings, nose rings, and possibly elaborate headdresses completed the personal adornment. This jewelry served both decorative and possibly symbolic purposes, perhaps indicating social status, marital state, or religious affiliation. Textiles were important, though they rarely survive in archaeological sites due to decay. However, indirect evidence suggests sophisticated textile production. Spindle whorls for spinning thread are common finds, and clay models depict people wearing draped clothing. The Indus region likely produced cotton textiles, with cotton cultivation possibly originating in this area. The warm climate would have made cotton cloth ideal for comfort, and cotton became one of the Indus civilization's valuable trade exports. Daily life followed seasonal rhythms determined by monsoon rains and agricultural cycles. The monsoon brought life-giving rain necessary for crops, but also caused river flooding that could damage cities. During the intense heat of summer before monsoon rains, life would slow down during the hottest parts of the day. The cooler season after monsoons brought relief and busy activity. These seasonal patterns structured work, festivals, and social life. Though without written records, we don't know specific details about seasonal celebrations or religious observances. Markets would have been central to urban life, places where farmers sold produce, craftsmen sold their goods, and traders offered exotic items from distant lands. Though we haven't definitively identified market structures, the commercial nature of Indus society makes their existence certain. Here people would have gathered not just to trade, but to exchange news, socialize, and participate in community life. The Indus Valley Civilization produced art that demonstrates both technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. Though it differs noticeably from the monumental art of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Rather than massive statues of gods and kings, Indus art tends towards smaller, more intimate objects, seals, figurines, jewelry, and decorated pottery. This focus on smaller-scale art reflects the civilization's apparent lack of powerful monarchs demanding grand monuments to their glory. The stone seals are among the most numerous and important Indus artifacts, typically carved from steatite, soapstone. These square seals measure about 1 to 2 inches on each side and feature both imagery and inscriptions in the Indus script. The imagery is remarkably detailed despite the small size, bulls rendered with anatomical accuracy, elephants showing realistic proportions and features, tigers in dynamic poses. The most mysterious seal images show a figure sitting in what appears to be a meditation pose, surrounded by animals including elephants, tigers, rhinos, and buffalo. Some scholars have interpreted this as a proto-Shiva figure, suggesting early roots of later Hindu traditions, though this remains speculative. The famous dancing girl bronze statue from Mohenjo-daro captures something remarkably human across 4 millennia. This small figure, only about 4 inches tall, shows a young woman standing in a casual, confident pose with one hand on her hip. She wears bangles on her left arm and appears completely at ease, almost defiant, in her self-assured stance. The statue was created using the lost wax casting process, demonstrating sophisticated metalworking techniques. What makes this piece so compelling isn't just its technical achievement, but its suggestion of personality. This isn't an idealized goddess or formal royal portrait, but seemingly a real person, captured in a moment of casual confidence. Another significant piece is the priest-king sculpture, despite its misleading name. This small stone sculpture from Mohenjo-daro shows a bearded man wearing a decorated robe with a trefoil pattern. His head is bound with a fillet or headband, and his half-closed eyes give an appearance of meditation or inward contemplation. Whether he was actually a priest or king is unknown. The title reflects archaeologists' assumptions rather than confirmed fact. The sculpture's refined features and formal pose suggest it represented someone of importance, but who exactly remains mysterious. Terracotta figurines are numerous and varied. Many depict female figures with elaborate headdresses and jewelry, often interpreted as mother goddesses or fertility symbols. Though this interpretation is based on comparison with later religious traditions rather than definitive evidence, male figurines are less common. Animal figurines include cattle, which were clearly important to the economy, along with dogs, elephants, and birds. Some figurines appear to be toys, given their simple construction and discovery in domestic contexts. Jewelry demonstrates both technical skill and aesthetic taste. Bead makers could drill perfectly straight holes through tiny carnelian beads using specialized drills, a process requiring extreme precision and patience. Necklaces were strung with graduated beads of different colors and materials, showing an eye for balance and visual appeal. Gold beads and ornaments demonstrate metalworking abilities, though gold items are less common than stone or bronze pieces, possibly indicating their precious status. Pottery was functional, but often well-crafted. While Indus pottery wasn't as elaborately decorated as Greek pottery or Chinese ceramics, it showed good proportions and practical design. Decorations when present included geometric patterns painted in black on a red background, or simple incised lines and textures. The emphasis was clearly on utility rather than elaborate decoration, consistent with the practical focus evident in Indus architecture and city planning. The art reveals something important about Indus values and society. The absence of massive statues, glorifying rulers, the focus on smaller-scale objects, and the emphasis on skilled craftsmanship over monumental display suggest a civilization with different priorities than their contemporaries. They valued beauty and artistry, but expressed it through functional objects and personal adornment rather than public monuments. This could reflect their apparently more egalitarian social structure or simply different cultural values about the appropriate expression of artistic impulses. The artistic achievement becomes even more impressive when we remember these works were created over 4,000 years ago using Stone Age and Bronze Age technology. The precision of the seal carving, the sophistication of the bronze casting, the delicate drilling of tiny stone beads, all required not just artistic talent, but patient mastery of difficult techniques developed over generations of practice and experimentation. The Indus craftsmen were true artists who combined technical excellence with aesthetic sensibility to create objects that still impress us across 4 millennia. The animal imagery found throughout Indus artifacts provides fascinating insights into how these ancient people viewed the natural world and what creatures held significance in their culture. The seals, pottery, and other decorated objects feature a remarkable bestiary of animals, some realistic and others mysterious or symbolic. The most commonly depicted animal on Indus seals is the zebu bull, a humped cattle species that remains important in South Asian culture today. These bulls appear on hundreds of seals, rendered with careful attention to anatomical detail. The pronounced shoulder hump, the dewlap hanging beneath the neck, the curve of the horns. The frequent appearance of bulls suggests they held special importance, possibly religious significance or symbolic value, beyond their practical role in agriculture and transport. Bulls have represented strength, fertility, and divine power in many ancient cultures, and the Indus people likely held similar associations. Elephants appear frequently on seals and other artifacts, depicted with remarkable accuracy, including proper proportions, trunk positions, and the distinctive shape of their heads and ears. The Indian elephant was native to the Indus region and would have been a familiar sight, perhaps domesticated for labor, as they were in later Indian civilizations. The elephant's size, strength, and intelligence likely made it a powerful symbol, though we can only speculate about specific meanings without readable texts. Tigers, another animal native to the region, appear in dynamic poses, suggesting power and ferocity. Some seals show tigers in profile, with visible stripes, while others depict them in more stylized forms. The presence of dangerous predators in Indus art suggests they commanded respect and possibly held totemic or protective significance. Rhinoceros images appear less frequently, but with similar attention to realistic detail. These massive animals, even more dangerous than tigers, must have made powerful impressions on people who encountered them. Their inclusion in seal imagery suggests they held symbolic importance, despite the danger they represented. Perhaps the most intriguing animal depicted in Indus art is the so-called unicorn, a creature that appears on approximately 60% of all Indus seals. This animal is shown in profile, with a single horn, though it's unclear whether this represents a real animal seen from an angle that obscures the second horn, a mythological creature, or a symbolic representation of something else entirely. The body proportions suggest a bull or similar bovine, and some scholars propose it might be an artistic convention, showing bulls from a specific angle, rather than a separate creature. The prevalence of this image suggests it was centrally important to Indus culture, possibly representing a powerful deity, a royal symbol, or a significant religious concept. Water buffaloes, goats, and sheep also appear in Indus art, reflecting the domesticated animals that form the basis of the agricultural economy. These depictions are generally simpler than the more prestigious wild animals, suggesting a distinction in symbolic importance between working animals and those with spiritual or totemic significance. Birds appear less frequently than mammals, but are depicted with care when they do appear. Some pottery shows painted birds, and small terracotta bird figurines have been found, possibly children's toys. The relative scarcity of bird imagery compared to mammals is interesting, perhaps reflecting the greater importance of land animals in Indus culture and economy. Fish imagery appears on pottery, and occasionally on seals, reflecting the importance of fishing to the Indus diet. Rivers and the sea provided crucial protein sources, and fish would have been familiar to everyone in this civilization. The realistic depiction of different fish species shows careful observation of the natural world. Crocodiles or gharials, fish-eating crocodiles native to Indian rivers, appear occasionally in Indus art. These dangerous reptiles must have been both feared and respected by people living along rivers. Their inclusion in symbolic imagery might represent the power and danger of water itself, or they might have had specific mythological significance now lost to us. Trees and plants appear less commonly in Indus iconography than animals, but when they do appear, they're often associated with ritual or religious scenes. Some seals show what appears to be a peepal tree, a type of fig tree, still considered sacred in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, with a figure seated beneath it in meditation. This suggests that certain trees held spiritual significance, possibly as dwelling places of spirits, or as symbols of eternal life and renewal. The mysterious horned deity, or seated figure, appears on several seals, surrounded by animals. This figure sits in what appears to be a yoga position, with arms extended, wearing a horned headdress, and surrounded by a tiger, elephant, rhinoceros, buffalo, and 2 deer or antelopes. Some scholars interpret this as a proto-Shiva figure, an early form of the Hindu god, who is lord of animals and master of yoga. However, this interpretation remains controversial and speculative, without texts to confirm religious beliefs. The animal symbols might have represented clans, families, merchant guilds, or administrative divisions. In many ancient societies, groups identified themselves with animal totems, using them on banners, seals, and other identifiers. The Indus seals could have functioned similarly, with different animals representing different organizations or social groups. However, the predominance of certain animals, like the unicorn, suggests meanings more complex than simple organizational identifiers. What's particularly striking about Indus animal art is its naturalism. Unlike the highly stylized or fantastical animal art common in some ancient cultures, Indus artists generally depicted animals as they actually appeared in nature, suggesting a culture that valued careful observation and realistic representation. This naturalism aligns with the practical observation-based approach evident in Indus engineering and city planning, a civilization that looked carefully at the real world and tried to understand and represent it accurately. Around 2500 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization reached its mature phase and greatest extent. During this period, which lasted until approximately 1900 BCE, the civilization flourished across an enormous territory, developed sophisticated urban centers, and became one of the most populous and economically successful societies in the ancient world. At its peak, the Indus civilization covered approximately 1.25 million square kilometers, making it the largest of the ancient civilizations in geographic extent. This territory encompassed the Indus River Valley and its tributaries, extending eastward into the Ganges-Yamuna Doab, westward to the Makran coast, northward into what is now Afghanistan, and southward into Gujarat and the northwestern Deccan. Within this vast area, archaeologists have identified over 1,400 settlements, ranging from small farming villages to major urban centers. The population during this mature phase may have reached 5 million people or more, though population estimates for ancient civilizations are inherently uncertain. Major cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa probably housed 40,000 to 50,000 people each, making them comparable in size to contemporary cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The urban population was supported by a larger rural population of farmers, herders, and village craftsmen who produced the food and raw materials necessary for urban life. The economy was diverse and sophisticated. Agriculture formed the foundation, with farmers cultivating wheat and barley as primary grains, along with peas, lentils, sesame, and dates. In wetter regions, they grew rice. They kept cattle, water buffalo, sheep, goats, and chickens. Farmers used plows, pulled by draft animals, a technology that dramatically increased agricultural productivity compared to hand cultivation. The annual monsoon rains provided crucial water for crops, though the civilization also developed irrigation systems to extend cultivation into drier areas and to ensure more reliable harvests. Beyond agriculture, the economy included extensive craft specialization. Cities contained workshops for bead-making, pottery production, metalworking, textile manufacturing, seal carving, and shell working. This specialization meant that individual craftsmen could focus on perfecting particular skills rather than being self-sufficient generalists. The resulting products were of high quality and could be traded both within the civilization and with distant trading partners. Trade networks extended across South Asia and beyond. Maritime trade connected Indus ports with the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia. Land routes reached into Central Asia, Afghanistan, and across the Iranian plateau. These trade connections brought wealth to Indus cities and provided access to resources not available locally. Mesopotamian cuneiform texts from this period specifically mention trade with Meluhha, the Indus region, describing imports of carnelian beads, ivory, timber, and other goods. The standardization evident throughout the civilization reached its peak during this mature phase. Not only were bricks manufactured to uniform sizes across all sites, but weights and measures followed consistent systems, pottery styles remained similar across vast distances, and urban planning principles were applied consistently in cities separated by hundreds of miles. This standardization implies either strong central authority setting and enforcing standards, or more likely, a shared cultural identity so strong that people across the civilization voluntarily maintained common practices and standards. The cities themselves functioned as administrative, commercial, and possibly religious centers. The citadel areas housed important public buildings including large baths, granaries for storing surplus grain, and assembly halls. The lower cities contained residential areas, workshops, and markets. The drainage systems, street grids, and public architecture all indicate sophisticated civic organization and the ability to mobilize labor for large-scale public works projects. Quality of life appears to have been relatively high compared to other ancient civilizations. The emphasis on sanitation and public health infrastructure, the relatively equitable distribution of resources evident in housing patterns, and the availability of imported luxury goods, even in middle-class homes, all suggest a prosperous society with widespread access to material comfort. Skeletal evidence indicates generally good health and nutrition, with life expectancy comparable to, or better than, other Bronze Age populations. The civilization's success rested on several factors working together. The fertile soil and reliable water from rivers and monsoons enabled productive agriculture. The extensive territory provided access to diverse resources, timber from forested areas, metals from mineral-rich regions, stone for tools and construction, and marine resources from coastal areas. The strategic location between Mesopotamia and Central Asia facilitated profitable trade. The sophisticated urban planning and infrastructure created healthy, livable cities. The standardization and organization enabled large-scale coordination and efficient production. During this peak period, there's no evidence of major warfare or conflict. Unlike Mesopotamian cities, surrounded by massive defensive walls, or Egyptian monuments celebrating military victories, Indus sites show little concern with fortification or warfare. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of a peaceful civilization, though it could also mean that conflicts were resolved through other means, or that defensive measures have been misidentified or not yet discovered. The absence of obvious military focus suggests that Indus society prioritized trade, craft production, and civic infrastructure over martial glory. This was a civilization that had found a successful formula: productive agriculture supporting urban centers, skilled crafts enabling profitable trade, standardized systems facilitating coordination across vast distances, and infrastructure creating livable cities. For approximately 6 centuries, this formula worked remarkably well, allowing the Indus civilization to thrive and grow. Cities were continuously occupied, rebuilt after floods, and improved over generations. Trade flourished, population grew, and material culture became increasingly sophisticated. But nothing lasts forever. Even at the peak of success, forces were beginning to shift that would eventually unravel this carefully balanced system. Climate patterns that had been stable for millennia were starting to change. The rivers that had provided life-giving water for agriculture and urban life were beginning to shift their courses. The environmental conditions that had made the Indus Valley ideal for civilization were becoming less reliable. The decline wouldn't happen immediately or dramatically, but the seeds of change were already sprouting, during the civilization's greatest flourishing. The decline of the Indus Valley Civilization was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual deterioration that played out over several centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals subtle signs of trouble, beginning around 1900 BCE, marking the transition from the mature Harappan phase to what scholars call the late Harappan, or post-urban phase. One of the first signs of stress appears in the quality of urban planning and construction. In the earlier mature phase, cities were carefully maintained, with consistent street layouts, well-built houses, and functioning drainage systems. But in later occupation levels, archaeologists find evidence of declining standards. Streets that once ran straight began to be encroached upon by buildings extending into public rights-of-way. The careful grid pattern began to break down as new construction didn't respect the original city plan. Building quality deteriorated noticeably. While earlier structures used well-made, standardized baked bricks, later construction increasingly used recycled bricks from demolished buildings or poorly made sun-dried mud bricks. Houses were shoddily built compared to earlier standards. Room divisions became less regular. The overall impression is of a society that could no longer maintain the high standards of earlier generations, either due to resource constraints or breakdown in civic authority that had previously enforced building codes. The sophisticated drainage systems that had been hallmarks of Indus cities began to fail. Drains became clogged and weren't properly cleaned. Some drains were blocked by new construction built over them. In areas where drains had been maintained for centuries, they began to fill with debris and stop functioning. This breakdown in sanitation would have had serious health consequences, potentially increasing disease rates and contributing to population decline. Public buildings on the citadels show signs of modification and reuse, suggesting changed functions. What had been carefully planned public spaces became subdivided and converted to other uses. This might indicate breakdown of centralized authority, or simply changing social organization. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, for example, shows evidence of repairs and modifications in later periods that suggest it was being maintained, but perhaps used differently than originally intended. Housing patterns shifted, with some areas of cities becoming more densely occupied, while others were abandoned. This internal migration within cities suggests changing economic conditions or social disruption. In some neighborhoods, multiple families appear to have crowded into houses originally built for single families. This increased density, combined with failing sanitation systems, would have created unhealthy living conditions. Trade appears to have declined based on reduced evidence of imported goods in archaeological layers from this period. The carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, and other trade goods that had been common in earlier periods become scarcer. The seals that had been used extensively for trade and administration decrease in number and quality. This suggests a disruption of the long-distance trade networks that had brought prosperity to Indus cities. The standardization that had characterized the mature Indus civilization began to break down. Brick sizes became less uniform. Pottery styles diversified, with more regional variation. Weights and measures showed less consistency. This fragmentation suggests weakening of whatever mechanisms, whether centralized authority or shared cultural practices, had maintained standardization across the civilization. Some cities show evidence of flooding that caused damage requiring reconstruction. The cities were rebuilt, often multiple times, showing resilience and determination to maintain urban life. However, each rebuilding episode appears slightly less sophisticated than before, with lower quality construction and less adherence to the original city plan. Eventually, some cities gave up the struggle and were abandoned when floods destroyed them yet again. Population appears to have declined in major urban centers. This is evidenced by decreased density of occupation, abandonment of neighborhoods, and eventually abandonment of entire cities. The population didn't disappear entirely. People continued living in the region, but the large urban concentrations characteristic of the mature phase diminished significantly. Interestingly, while major cities declined, some smaller settlements in peripheral areas actually grew during this period. This suggests internal migration, with people leaving the old urban centers for smaller towns and villages. Some regions that had been sparsely populated during the mature phase show increased settlement in the late phase, indicating population redistribution rather than simple population collapse. The changes didn't happen uniformly across the entire civilization. Some regions and cities declined earlier than others. Mohenjo-daro, for instance, shows signs of decline earlier than some other sites. This staggered decline suggests localized factors were important, rather than a single catastrophic event affecting the entire civilization simultaneously. What's striking is the absence of evidence for violent destruction. There are no layers of ash, suggesting cities were burned. No mass graves indicating warfare or plague. No evidence of invading armies destroying urban centers. The decline appears to have been gradual and relatively peaceful, with people simply choosing to leave cities as conditions deteriorated rather than being forcibly driven out or killed. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of a civilization slowly unraveling. Standards that had been maintained for centuries were no longer being met. Infrastructure that had functioned reliably began to fail. Trade networks that had brought prosperity became disrupted. Population concentrations that had made cities vibrant and productive began to disperse. But the process was gradual enough that no single generation experienced dramatic collapse. To people living through it, each year might have seemed only slightly worse than the previous year, with the full scope of change only becoming apparent when viewed across generations. Climate change played a crucial role in the decline of the Indus Valley Civilization, though the exact mechanisms and timing remain subjects of active research. Multiple lines of evidence, geological, archaeological, and paleoclimatic, suggest that the environmental conditions that had supported the civilization's growth began to shift around 2000 to 1900 BCE. The Indus civilization had flourished during a period of relatively strong and reliable monsoon rains. The summer monsoon, which brings crucial rainfall to South Asia, had been robust and consistent for millennia, supporting productive agriculture and maintaining reliable water flow in rivers. But paleoclimatic evidence indicates that monsoon patterns began to weaken around 2000 BCE, leading to reduced rainfall across the Indus region. Evidence for this climate shift comes from multiple sources. Lake sediment cores from the region show changes in pollen composition, with species adapted to wetter conditions decreasing while drought-tolerant species increase. Ocean sediment cores from the Arabian Sea show changes in chemical composition, indicating reduced river runoff from the land. Stalagmites in caves preserve isotopic records showing decreased monsoon intensity. Together, these independent lines of evidence paint a consistent picture of drying climate. The weakening monsoon would have had cascading effects on the Indus civilization. Reduced rainfall meant decreased agricultural productivity. Crops that had grown reliably for centuries began to fail more frequently. Farmers might have experienced a series of poor harvests, gradually depleting stored reserves. As food became scarcer, cities that depended on agricultural surplus would have found themselves unable to support large populations. The rivers that had been the lifeblood of the civilization were directly affected by reduced monsoon rains. Lower rainfall meant reduced river flow, particularly during the dry season. Rivers that had been perennial might have become seasonal, flowing strongly during monsoon months, but drying up or becoming shallow streams during the rest of the year. This would have disrupted agriculture that depended on irrigation from rivers and affected transportation and trade that used rivers as routes. Some evidence suggests that the changes weren't simply a gradual drying trend, but included increased climate variability. This means that alongside generally reduced rainfall, there might have been more extreme events, severe droughts, interspersed with occasional heavy flooding. Such variability would have been particularly difficult for agricultural societies to adapt to, as farming practices optimized for stable conditions perform poorly when conditions become unpredictable. The impact of climate change would have varied geographically across the large Indus territory. Regions more dependent on monsoon rains would have been affected earlier and more severely than regions with other water sources. Areas with groundwater access, or fed by glacial melt from Himalayan mountains, might have remained productive longer. This could explain why some Indus cities declined earlier than others, and why population shifted towards certain regions while abandoning others. Archaeological evidence supports climate-driven agricultural stress. Analysis of crop remains shows shifts in agricultural practices during the late Harappan period. There's increased emphasis on drought-tolerant crops and reduced cultivation of water-intensive crops. This represents adaptive response to changing conditions, but it also indicates that farmers were experiencing water stress and adjusting their practices to cope. The relationship between climate change and civilization decline is complex and not simply deterministic. Climate change created challenges, but how societies respond to those challenges determines outcomes. The Indus people weren't passive victims of climate change. They adapted their agricultural practices, modified settlement patterns, and adjusted their economy. However, the adaptations had limits, and when environmental stress exceeded the civilization's capacity to adapt, decline became inevitable. Modern climate science has provided context for understanding ancient climate change. We now know that climate varies naturally on multiple timescales, decades, centuries, and millennia, in response to changes in solar output, volcanic activity, ocean currents, and other factors. The weakening of the monsoon, around 2000 BCE, appears to have been part of a broader pattern of climate change, affecting regions well beyond South Asia. Contemporary civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and the Iranian Plateau also experienced climate disruptions around the same time. The climate changes alone might not have caused the civilization's decline if other factors hadn't compounded the stress. A robust civilization with diverse economic base, adaptive institutions, and available alternative resources might have weathered the climate shift. But combined with other factors, particularly the shifting courses of major rivers discussed in the next chapter, the climate changes became part of a perfect storm of environmental pressures that overwhelmed the civilization's adaptive capacity. Understanding climate's role in the Indus decline has modern relevance. It demonstrates how civilizations dependent on specific environmental conditions can be vulnerable when those conditions change. It shows that gradual environmental changes, operating over generations rather than years, can have profound cumulative impacts. And it illustrates that even sophisticated societies, with advanced technology and organization, can struggle to adapt when fundamental environmental conditions shift beyond critical thresholds. Perhaps the most catastrophic environmental change affecting the Indus civilization was the shifting and drying of major rivers. Rivers in the Indus region are dynamic geological features that can change course dramatically over centuries due to tectonic activity, sediment accumulation, and flood events. During the civilization's decline, several rivers underwent changes that devastated the cities depending on them. The most significant river change involved the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which flowed through what is now the dried bed of a river running through Rajasthan and Punjab. During the mature Harappan period, this was apparently a major perennial river, possibly fed by Himalayan glacial melt and monsoon rains. Archaeological surveys have identified numerous Harappan settlements along its course, suggesting it was crucial to the civilization. But Paleochannel studies show that this river system began to dry up or shift course around 2000 to 1900 BCE. The drying of the Gagar Hakra would have been catastrophic for settlements dependent on it. Cities and villages that had relied on its water for drinking, irrigation, and transportation suddenly found themselves without their essential water source. Archaeological evidence shows that many settlements along the dried river course were abandoned during the late Harappan period, consistent with the loss of this vital resource. The exact cause of the Gagar Hakra's disappearance remains debated. One hypothesis suggests that tectonic activity in the Himalayan foothills disrupted the river's tributaries, causing them to shift into other drainage systems like the Indus or Ganges. Another possibility is that climate change reduced water flow until the river could no longer maintain its course, with the remaining water being absorbed by sediments before reaching the plains. A third possibility involves the river's tributaries being captured by other rivers through a process called stream piracy, where erosion allows one river system to drain another's headwaters. The Indus River itself, while continuing to flow, likely changed its course in some areas. Rivers flowing across flat alluvial plains naturally meander and shift channels, especially during major flood events. A city that was once on a river's bank might find itself miles from the river after the river carved a new channel following a catastrophic flood. This would have disrupted river-dependent activities like transportation, fishing, and irrigation. The Ravi River, one of the tributaries of the Indus, near Harappa, appears to have shifted its course during the late Harappan period. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that Harappa may have been affected by changes in the Ravi's flow pattern. While the city wasn't completely abandoned when the river shifted, its importance and population declined, consistent with losing convenient river access. River changes affected cities in multiple ways, beyond just water supply. Rivers served as transportation routes for trade goods, allowing boats to carry heavy cargo much more efficiently than overland transport. When rivers shifted course or dried up, trade routes were disrupted, isolating cities that had been well-connected commercial centers. This economic isolation would have contributed to urban decline, even if water for drinking and irrigation could be found from other sources like wells. The timing of river changes correlates closely with archaeological evidence of urban decline. Sites along rivers that disappeared or shifted show abandonment or sharp population decline around 1900 to 1800 BCE. Sites near rivers that continue flowing show the longer occupation, though often with reduced prosperity. This geographic pattern strongly suggests that river changes were a major driver of the civilization's transformation. The Indus people weren't helpless in the face of river changes. Archaeological evidence shows they attempted to adapt. They dug deeper wells to access groundwater when surface water became scarce. They constructed water harvesting systems to capture and store seasonal rainfall. They shifted settlements to locations with more reliable water sources. But these adaptations had limits, and when major rivers disappeared entirely, adaptation became impossible for large urban populations. The combination of reduced monsoon rainfall and river changes created a water crisis that agrarian urban civilization couldn't survive. Agriculture requires reliable water, and when both rain and rivers become unreliable, crop failures multiply. Cities require not just enough water for residents to drink, but massive quantities to support surrounding agricultural hinterlands. When water sources fail, cities cannot maintain themselves. Modern geological studies using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and sediment core analysis have mapped the ancient river courses and documented when they were active. This work has revealed a landscape dramatically different from today's, with rivers flowing where now only dry beds remain. Understanding this ancient hydrology helps explain why Indus cities were located where they were and why they were abandoned when river systems failed. The river changes weren't unique to the Indus region. Across the northern Indian subcontinent, river systems evolved and changed during the Holocene epoch. The unusual aspect for the Indus civilization was the timing. Major rivers changed course or dried up precisely when monsoon weakening was already stressing agriculture. The combination of these two environmental changes created conditions that even sophisticated adaptive civilization couldn't overcome. The decline of the Indus Valley Civilization wasn't characterized by sudden mass death or violent destruction, but rather by gradual migration, as people left cities for other regions. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern South Asia tracks this demographic shift as populations moved away from traditional Indus heartlands toward new areas offering better prospects. Migration appears to have followed several patterns. One significant movement was eastward toward the Ganges-Yamuna river system. While the western rivers that had supported the Indus civilization were drying or shifting, the Ganges system maintained more reliable flow, fed by Himalayan glacial melt and monsoon rains in the eastern regions. Archaeological sites in what is now Uttar Pradesh and Haryana show increased population during the late Harappan period, with settlement patterns and artifacts showing clear Harappan cultural influences. Another migration stream flowed southward into Gujarat and toward the Deccan Plateau. These regions had been peripheral to the main Indus civilization, but became more heavily settled as people left the drought-stricken northwest. Sites like Lothal in Gujarat continued occupation even as cities like Mohenjo-daro were abandoned. The southern and southeastern regions apparently maintained better environmental conditions, supporting continued settlement. Some population moved into the Himalayan foothills and sub-montane regions. These areas had been lightly settled during the mature Harappan period, but show increased settlement in late Harappan times. The foothills offered different environmental conditions, more reliable water from mountain streams, different agricultural possibilities, and escape from the deteriorating conditions on the plains. The migration wasn't a single coordinated movement, but rather accumulated individual and small group decisions made over many generations. Families would have left cities when conditions became untenable, when drought destroyed crops repeatedly, when wells dried up, when floods destroyed homes once too often. They would seek relatives in other regions, follow trade routes to areas they'd heard about, or simply move toward regions with visible water and vegetation. The migrants carried Harappan cultural traditions with them, which is how we can track their movement archaeologically. They continued making similar pottery styles, using similar tools, maintaining similar architectural preferences, and preserving certain cultural practices. However, as they settled in new regions with different environments and mixed with local populations, their culture gradually transformed. The distinctive Harappan characteristics became diluted and modified, creating regional variations that eventually evolved into the diverse cultures of later periods. The pace of migration varied by region and over time. Some cities were abandoned relatively quickly, within a few generations, while others maintained reduced populations for centuries. Mohenjo-daro, for instance, shows evidence of declining population and deteriorating conditions over several centuries before final abandonment, around 1700 BCE. Harappa maintained some occupation even longer, though at much reduced scale compared to its peak. Not everyone migrated. Some populations remained in traditional Indus regions, but shifted from urban to rural lifestyles. Instead of living in large cities, they formed small farming villages and pastoral communities. This transition from urban to rural isn't necessarily a decline in quality of life. Rural communities can be prosperous and healthy, but it represents a fundamental change in social organization from the urbanized civilization of earlier periods. The migrants would have faced challenges in their new homes. They needed to learn new agricultural techniques, appropriate to different soils and climates. They had to establish relationships with populations already living in destination regions, which might have been cooperative or competitive. They had to adapt their traditional practices to new environments while maintaining enough cultural continuity to preserve their identity. Some scholars argue that the Harappan migrants contributed to the formation of later Vedic culture. The Vedic texts, composed in Sanskrit beginning around 1500 BCE, describe societies in northern India with different characteristics than Harappan civilization, but potentially including some descendant populations. However, establishing clear cultural continuity between Harappans and later cultures is difficult given the absence of readable Harappan texts and the time gap between civilizations. The migration pattern helps explain why the Indus civilization seemingly disappeared from history. The people didn't die out. They dispersed, migrated, adapted to new regions, and gradually transformed culturally until they were no longer recognizably Harappan. Their descendants continued living in South Asia, but the distinctive urban civilization their ancestors had built was abandoned and eventually forgotten. This migration and dispersal also explains why no later South Asian tradition preserved memory of the Indus cities. By the time literate civilizations arose in India that could have recorded historical memory, the urban Harappan period was already ancient, abandoned for over 1,000 years. The scattered descendant populations living in various regions probably had fragmented oral traditions about the old cities. But without written records, these memories faded and were lost. Modern parallels exist for this kind of civilizational abandonment. The Maya cities of Central America were largely abandoned in the 9th century CE, with populations dispersing to other regions. When Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, magnificent cities stood empty in jungles, and even local populations had lost detailed knowledge of who had built them. The Indus abandonment followed a similar pattern: gradual population dispersal, leaving empty cities that were eventually buried and forgotten. Imagine walking through Mohenjo-daro in its final years of occupation. The city that once housed tens of thousands now holds only a few thousand residents, clustered in certain neighborhoods, while other areas stand abandoned and deteriorating. The careful grid of streets remains visible, but many are littered with debris and blocked by collapsed buildings. The sophisticated drainage system, once the city's pride, is clogged and non-functional in many areas. The great public buildings on the citadel still stand but show neglect. The Great Bath, which once hosted important ceremonies or gatherings, perhaps still functions, but serves a reduced population. The granaries that stored surplus grain from prosperous agricultural hinterlands stand partially empty or converted to other uses, as the agricultural system that supported urban life has broken down. In the lower city, many houses stand empty, their doors and windows open to the elements. Some have been partially dismantled by remaining residents, scavenging bricks and timber for repairs on their own dwellings. The standardized bricks that once symbolized the civilization's organizational capacity are now just convenient building materials taken from wherever they're available. New construction, when it occurs, doesn't follow the old grid pattern, but fills in spaces haphazardly. The workshops that once produced goods for trade, bead makers, metal workers, potters, have largely shut down. Without functioning trade networks to distribute their products and bring raw materials, specialized craft production isn't economically viable. The remaining population largely consists of farmers and herders, living a more self-sufficient rural lifestyle, despite being nominally in a city. The wells that provided water to households still function where water table remains high enough. But some have run dry as groundwater depletes under drought conditions. Residents must walk farther to find water, and the convenient access to private wells that characterized prosperous Harappan homes is no longer universal. Water scarcity affects daily life in countless ways. Less bathing, less washing of clothes and dishes, more effort devoted to simply acquiring enough water to survive. The streets that once bustled with merchants, craftsmen, workers, children playing, and all the activity of urban life are quiet. You might see a few people going about necessary tasks, drawing water from a well, herding goats through the streets, carrying firewood. But the vibrant urban atmosphere that characterized the city in its prime has vanished. This is no longer a thriving commercial and administrative center, but a dying settlement, clinging to existence in deteriorating conditions. Some families are making the decision to leave. You might see a group preparing for departure, loading what possessions they can carry onto carts, saying farewell to neighbors who are staying a bit longer. They're heading east, toward relatives in the Ganges Valley, or south toward Gujarat, where they've heard conditions are better. The migration is slow and painful, leaving a home that families have occupied for generations, abandoning a city their ancestors helped build, but seeing no future in staying as conditions continue worsening. Flood damage is visible in some areas where the river has overflowed during monsoon season. Unlike earlier periods when such damage was quickly repaired with the city rebuilt to original standards, now the damaged areas are simply abandoned. The social organization and resources necessary for major reconstruction efforts no longer exist. Each flood or disaster leaves permanent scars rather than being overcome through community effort. The animals that once provided transportation and agricultural labor are fewer. Maintaining large herds requires adequate pasture and water, both increasingly scarce. Some residents have slaughtered animals for food rather than trying to keep them alive through drought. The cattle that survive are thin and stressed, no longer the healthy animals depicted on seals from the city's prosperous days. Perhaps most poignantly, the Great Bath stands empty now. Whether it last functioned for ritual purification, social gathering, or some other purpose we don't understand, it no longer serves active use. The elaborate waterproofing remains intact. The brick steps still descend into the basin, but no water fills it. The ritual or social functions it served have ended along with the prosperity that supported them. It stands as monument to what the city once was and what it has lost. Over the following decades and centuries, even the remaining population dwindles and eventually disappears. The last residents leave for better prospects elsewhere, or die without successors to maintain occupation. The city becomes truly empty. No fires burning in courtyards, no voices echoing through streets, no children playing, no animals, no human presence at all. The buildings stand intact for a while, but without maintenance, they begin to decay. Roofs collapse, walls crack, vegetation begins to take root in streets and courtyards. Monsoon rains and annual floods gradually bury the abandoned city under layers of silt and soil. Dust storms add their contribution of wind-blown sand and dirt. Each year the accumulation grows, slowly burying the streets and buildings. Within a few generations the city is buried deeply enough that only vague mounds mark where buildings once stood. Eventually even those mounds blend into the landscape, and Mohenjo-daro becomes just another feature of the terrain, its identity as a city lost to human memory. This process repeated across the Indus civilization. City after city fell silent, was abandoned, was buried. The vast urban network that had connected hundreds of settlements shrank and fragmented. The sophisticated civilization that had flourished for 7 centuries ceased to exist, not through dramatic destruction, but through gradual abandonment as environmental conditions and social organization that supported urban life collapsed. For more than 3,000 years, the cities of the Indus Valley slept beneath the earth, completely forgotten by human civilization. Empires rose and fell over the buried cities: the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great's conquests; the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta Empire, various sultanates, the Mughal Empire, and finally British colonial rule, all without anyone knowing that ancient cities lay beneath their feet. Local populations living in the regions had no memory of the cities. The mounds dotting the landscape were simply geographical features, perhaps noted as good places to quarry old bricks for building material, but not recognized as archaeological sites of any significance. If oral traditions about old cities once existed, they had long since faded beyond recognition into vague legends about giants or spirits. The rediscovery process began accidentally in the mid-1800s, when British colonial engineers needed building materials for India's expanding railway system. Workers excavated the mysterious mounds, searching for ballast, crushed brick and stone to support railroad tracks. They found thousands upon thousands of ancient bricks buried in the mounds, perfect for their purposes. For decades, bricks from cities like Harappa were crushed and used in railroad construction, with no one realizing they were destroying irreplaceable archaeological evidence of ancient civilization. In 1912, archaeologist J. Fleet examined some seals that had been found and published a paper noting they appeared to be from an unknown ancient culture. But World War I intervened, and serious archaeological investigation had to wait until the 1920s. The breakthrough came in 1921 to 1922, when archaeologists Daya Ramsani at Harappa and R.D. Banerjee at Mohenjo-daro began systematic excavations and quickly realized they had discovered something remarkable. John Marshall's 1924 announcement of the discoveries in the Illustrated London News created international sensation. Photographs of the excavations showed streets, buildings, drainage systems, and artifacts unlike anything previously known from ancient India. The implications were revolutionary. India had urban civilization contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, completely changing understanding of ancient South Asian history. Early excavations focused on major cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, revealing the sophisticated urban planning, drainage systems, and standardized architecture that characterized the civilization. As excavations continued through the 1920s and 1930s, more sites were discovered, revealing the civilization's vast extent. Archaeologists found cities, towns, and villages across an enormous territory, all sharing similar cultural characteristics. The 1940s and 1950s brought important theoretical work, as archaeologists like Mortimer Wheeler brought new methodologies to Indus excavations, applying more rigorous stratigraphic techniques that allowed better dating and understanding of how sites developed over time. Wheeler's work helped establish the chronology of the civilization and revealed evidence of multiple occupation phases and rebuilding episodes. The discovery of the Indus script created both excitement and frustration. Here was writing from ancient India, but unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphics, it resisted all attempts at decipherment. Scholars tried every approach, comparing it to known languages, applying statistical analysis, looking for patterns, but without a bilingual inscription or lengthy texts, the script remained stubbornly indecipherable. Post-independence India and Pakistan both invested in Indus research as the civilization became part of national heritage. Archaeological surveys identified hundreds of Indus sites across both countries. Excavations at new sites like Kalibangan, Lothal, and Dholavira revealed variations in Indus culture and new insights into how the civilization functioned. Lothal's document provided evidence of maritime trade. Dholavira's sophisticated water management systems demonstrated engineering capabilities. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized Indus research. Satellite imagery helps identify new sites and ancient river courses. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried structures without excavation. DNA analysis of skeletal remains provides information about population movements and relationships. Carbon dating and other chronometric techniques allow precise dating of occupation phases. Climate science has contributed crucial insights by reconstructing ancient environmental conditions. Studies of lake sediments, ocean cores, and cave deposits reveal monsoon patterns and climate changes that affected the civilization. This environmental data helps explain the civilization's rise and decline in relation to changing ecological conditions. Computer analysis has been applied to the Indus script, identifying statistical patterns and probable grammatical structures, though decipherment remains elusive. Digital reconstructions create virtual models of Indus cities, allowing researchers to explore and analyze urban organization. 3D scanning preserves detailed records of artifacts and architectural features. Each new discovery raises new questions while answering old ones. Recent excavations at Rakhigarhi, potentially the largest Indus site, are revealing new information about the civilization's eastern extent. Underwater archaeology off the Gujarat coast is investigating possible submerged Harappan sites. Genetic studies are tracking population movements and relationships between Indus people and later South Asian populations. The more we learn, the more complex and impressive the civilization appears. What started as surprising discovery of forgotten cities has become recognition of one of humanity's most sophisticated ancient civilizations, one that achieved remarkable urban planning, engineering, and social organization. Yet fundamental questions remain unanswered due to the undeciphered script. We can see what they built, but cannot hear their voices or read their thoughts. Modern research continues with new excavations, analyses of existing collections using advanced techniques, and interdisciplinary approaches, combining archaeology, climate science, genetics, linguistics, and other fields. The Indus Valley Civilization, forgotten for 3 millennia and rediscovered barely a century ago, continues revealing its secrets gradually through patient archaeological work. The end of the Indus Valley Civilization wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a gradual transformation from urban to rural lifestyle, from integrated civilization to dispersed regional cultures. This decline wasn't necessarily catastrophic for the people themselves, but represented a fundamental change in how society was organized and how people lived their daily lives. The traditional interpretation of collapse implies failure and disaster, but this framing may be misleading. The Indus people didn't fail. They adapted to changing environmental and social conditions by transitioning from urban to rural lifestyle. Villages can be prosperous and healthy, even if they lack the monumental architecture and urban density of cities. The question isn't whether life became universally worse, but rather why the specific form of social organization that produced Indus cities couldn't be sustained. The transition varied by region and occurred over centuries rather than decades. Some areas maintained urban or semi-urban settlements much longer than others. Gujarat, for instance, shows continued occupation of Harappan tradition sites well into the 2nd millennium BCE, even as the great cities of the Indus Valley were abandoned. This regional variation suggests local factors: environment, access to resources, trade networks, significantly affected how the decline played out in different areas. Cultural continuity can be traced through certain archaeological markers. Pottery styles evolved, but show clear descent from Harappan forms. Architectural traditions persisted in modified form. Certain crafts continued, though often at reduced sophistication. The people themselves didn't vanish. They changed how they lived and gradually transformed culturally until they were no longer recognizably Harappan in the archaeological sense. Some traditions may have been preserved and transmitted to later cultures, though proving specific continuity is difficult. Certain motifs, religious concepts, and practices found in later South Asian civilizations might have Harappan roots, but without readable Harappan texts, we cannot definitely trace such continuity. Proposed connections between Harappan symbols and later Hindu iconography remain speculative but intriguing. The relationship between declining Harappan civilization and emerging Vedic culture of northern India is complex and debated. The Vedic texts, composed in Sanskrit beginning around 1500 BCE, describe societies significantly different from Harappan cities. Vedic culture was predominantly pastoral, rather than urban, had different material culture, and appears to have been organized along different social lines. Yet both existed in overlapping geographical areas, raising questions about their relationship. Some scholars propose that Vedic-speaking peoples migrated into South Asia as Harappan civilization declined, eventually becoming dominant in northern India. Others suggest more complex interactions with continuity and mixing between Harappan and Vedic populations. Genetic studies indicate population movements and mixing during this period, but don't resolve cultural questions. Language shift from whatever Harappans spoke to Indo-Aryan languages could have occurred through various mechanisms: migration, elite dominance, or gradual adoption. What's clear is that by 1300 BCE, the distinctive Harappan civilization had ended. The urban network was abandoned, the writing system disappeared, the standardized culture fragmented into regional variants. The civilization that had thrived for nearly 2,000 years, including its early phases, had transformed into something different enough that archaeologists no longer classify it as Harappan. Yet the region didn't become depopulated or impoverished. Later centuries saw new urban centers arise. In the Ganges Valley, new civilizations emerge, and continued cultural development, leading eventually to the classical civilizations of ancient India. The end of Harappan civilization was a transition rather than a terminus, the closing of one chapter in South Asian history and the opening of another. The Harappan decline offers lessons about civilizational resilience and vulnerability. It shows how civilization dependent on specific environmental conditions can struggle when those conditions change. It demonstrates that sophisticated technology and social organization don't guarantee survival if underlying resource base shifts. It illustrates how gradual changes operating over generations can have profound cumulative impacts that catastrophic events happening quickly might not achieve. But it also shows human resilience and adaptability. The descendants of Harappans didn't simply perish when cities became untenable. They adapted, migrated, adopted new lifestyles, and continued. Civilization in the formal sense of urban, literate, complex society ended. But life continued, and eventually new forms of civilization emerged. The story isn't simply one of loss, but of transformation and continuation in different forms. The Harappan experience raises questions about how we define and measure civilization. If we focus only on monumental architecture and urban density, the transition from Harappan to post-Harappan appears as decline. But if we consider quality of life, environmental sustainability, and human adaptation to changing conditions, the picture becomes more complex. Rural communities can be successful and prosperous, even if they don't build cities or maintain writing systems. The civilization faded not through violent conquest or a catastrophic disaster, but through accumulated environmental stress, changing river courses, weakening monsoons, and the resulting economic and social pressures that made maintaining urban centers increasingly difficult. When the costs of urban life exceeded the benefits, people chose other ways of living. The cities were abandoned, not because people died, but because they found better opportunities elsewhere. Today, the ruins of Indus cities stand as silent witnesses to a civilization that flourished 4,000 years ago and then faded into obscurity for 3 millennia. Archaeologists continue excavating, analyzing, and learning from these sites, gradually piecing together the story of people whose voices we cannot hear, but whose achievements still impress us across the gulf of time. Walking through Mohenjo-daro today, you see the excavated portions of the city, perhaps 10% of the total site, with the rest still buried. The brick streets and buildings, remarkably preserved despite 40 centuries, show the skill and planning that went into the city's construction. The drainage channels still visible beneath streets demonstrate engineering sophistication that wouldn't be matched in many regions for thousands of years. The Great Bath, though empty now, still shows its careful construction and waterproofing. But these are just stones and bricks. They show us what Harappans built, but not who they were as people. They demonstrate engineering capability, but not beliefs, values, or personal stories. The greatest monument, the undeciphered script, stands between us and true understanding of this civilization. Until that script yields its secrets, the Harappans remain mysterious, despite all our archaeological knowledge. The mystery of the Indus script continues to frustrate scholars. Every few years, someone announces a breakthrough in decipherment, but none have withstood peer review and critical examination. The short inscriptions, the lack of bilingual texts, and the absence of lengthy passages make decipherment extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible, without finding new types of evidence. The script mocks us, visible yet unreadable, preserving its secrets despite a century of intense scholarly effort. Yet research continues, and new discoveries still occur. Rakigari, recently excavated, has revealed a massive city, potentially larger than Mohenjo-daro, expanding our understanding of the civilization's scale and distribution. Underwater surveys off Gujarat's coast are investigating sites that might have been submerged as sea levels rose. New analytical techniques applied to old collections are revealing information that earlier excavators missed. DNA analysis of skeletal remains is providing insights into Harappan population genetics and relationships with later South Asian populations. This research suggests genetic continuity, with modern South Asians carrying genetic heritage from Harappan ancestors mixed with other populations who arrived later. The Harappans didn't vanish. Their descendants are among the billion-plus people living in South Asia today. Climate research continues refining our understanding of environmental changes during the Harappan period. Better paleoclimatic data helps explain why the civilization flourished when it did, and why it encountered difficulties when monsoon patterns shifted and rivers changed course. This research makes the Harappan experience relevant to modern concerns about climate change and civilizational resilience. The Indus cities also offer lessons in urban planning and sustainable living. Their emphasis on sanitation and public health infrastructure, their relatively egalitarian social structure, their efficient use of standardized systems. These remain relevant examples for modern urban planners and policymakers. The Harappans solved problems that many modern cities still struggle with. For Pakistan and India, the Indus Valley Civilization represents important cultural heritage. Sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are national treasures, tourist destinations, and sources of pride. They demonstrate that South Asian civilization has roots stretching back 5,000 years to one of humanity's first great urban cultures. Schools teach Harappan history, museums display artifacts, and the civilization features prominently in cultural narratives. The story of the Indus civilization resonates beyond South Asia. It's part of human heritage, showing what our ancient ancestors achieved, and reminding us that sophisticated civilizations existed long before recent millennia. It demonstrates human capability for creating complex, organized societies, even with Bronze Age technology. It shows both the achievements possible through social organization and the vulnerabilities that even sophisticated civilizations face. Perhaps most poignantly, the Indus civilization reminds us how fragile historical memory can be. A civilization housing millions, spanning over 1 million square kilometers, enduring for centuries, completely forgotten. If not for accident, railroad workers stumbling on buried bricks, we might still not know the Indus cities existed. How much else has been forgotten? How many civilizations rose, flourished, and fell, leaving no trace in historical memory? The silence of the Indus script has a poignant quality. These people had voices, thoughts, beliefs, stories. They recorded some of those thoughts in writing. The inscriptions survive. We can see them, but we cannot read them. It's like finding a letter from someone you want to know about, but written in an unknown language, with no way to translate it. The frustration of closeness without connection, of evidence without understanding, defines the Indus enigma. Yet despite the mystery, despite the undeciphered writing, despite the 3,000-year forgetting, the Indus Valley Civilization speaks to us. Through bricks laid in precise grids, through drainage systems showing engineering skill, through seals carved with care, through toys children played with, through jewelry people wore, through homes where families lived. The Harappans communicated across time. Not their words, but their works. Not their beliefs, but their achievements. As archaeologists continue excavating and analyzing, as new techniques reveal new information, as understanding gradually deepens, we come closer to these ancient people. We may never read their words or know their stories with the intimacy that readable texts would provide, but we can appreciate what they built, admire their achievements, and recognize them as fellow humans who faced challenges, created solutions, built civilizations, and left their mark on history, even though they couldn't know that mark would be forgotten for 3,000 years before being rediscovered. The wind moves across the ruins of Mohenjo-daro. Birds fly overhead. The sun rises and sets as it has for billions of years. And beneath the modern surface of South Asia, beneath farms and cities and roads, lie countless Harappan sites, still undiscovered, still buried, still keeping their secrets. The civilization may have faded 4,000 years ago, but its echoes remain, waiting patiently in the earth for those who will listen. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the lost cities of the Indus Valley. As you drift towards sleep, let these ancient stories settle gently in your mind. Stories of people who built remarkable cities, developed sophisticated technologies, and created a civilization that lasted for centuries before gradually fading into the silent earth. Their voices are lost to us, but their achievements remain, whispering across the millennia about human capability, ingenuity, and the complex relationship between civilization and the environment that sustains it. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you to ancient streets where life once flourished, where merchants traded, where children played, where families lived their daily lives 4,000 years ago, in cities now sleeping beneath the patient sand. Good night.